Pam Bondi thought the moment had passed, until Senator Whitehouse stood up, and in less than a minute, the entire room realized this wasn't going to be a routine hearing. Something was about to break wide open. The tension shifted, the energy changed, and what came next didn't just challenge the Justice Department's narrative, it tore straight through it. Because when a former FBI director gets arraigned one day for making false statements, and the Attorney General is accused of making even bigger ones the day before, people pay attention.
Exposed on his multiple false statements that his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case had been sealed by the department, was under court order not to be released, and had since been publicly released as a transcript. I don't know if this committee is going to take itself seriously enough to treat false statements to this committee as serious matters, irrespective of who made them.
When Senator Whitehouse took the mic, he didn't just defend himself, he dismantled the Justice Department's credibility. What he revealed about Pam Bondi's false claims and the FBI's contradictions should shake anyone who still believes in accountability. This wasn't politics as usual. This was a masterclass in truth versus power.
I'd like to make 2 points. The first has to do with Arctic frost and the information, Chairman, that you released the other day. It's been described as a politically weaponized investigation, but I ask my colleagues, should there have been no investigation of the raiding and the ransacking of the United States Capitol? Of course there should have been an investigation. And by the way, I was with many of you during those dark hours, and there was no doubt in anybody's mind in the Senate at that point that crimes had been committed and that they needed to be investigated. So please, let's not pretend that the fact that the FBI investigated the raiding and the ransacking of the United States Capitol is itself in any way politically weaponized. That is their job. To the question of senators being in the list of toll record investigations, I'm eager to get to the bottom of that. I think we should get to the bottom of that. But let's remember what this was. This was toll records, which for those of us who've been prosecuting for a while is similar to a pen register, which is where in the old days the phone company would clip a register onto the wire, and you wouldn't know what was said. You would only know what number called what other number and for how long. When you have what prosecutors would call predication to put a pen register on one number, you necessarily pick up everybody else who was called. That doesn't make them the subjects of any investigation. Similarly, if you're running a wiretap, and by the way, a pen register is not a wiretap, and senators on this committee should be knowledgeable and scrupulous enough not to confuse the two. But were this a wiretap, the same thing would take place. If, as U.S. Attorney, I got a wiretap on a Rhode Island mobster, and that mobster called the butcher, the baker, or the babysitter, the butcher, the baker, or the babysitter are now swept into the investigation by virtue of having been called. It doesn't make them the subject of any investigation. And with wiretaps, it works that you have minimization procedures, so you shut it off and so forth. But this wasn't a wiretap. This was toll records, the modern equivalent of a pen register that only shows who was called. So before we start to reach irate conclusions about weaponized FBIs going after people, it is worth taking a calming step back to consider the possibility that the FBI had proper predication for certain phones, and that those phones then called the senators. I don't know what happened, and I support the chairman's desire to investigate this. But we should investigate this without reaching dire conclusions before we have the evidence. Because there is a very clear investigative scenario in which the FBI has proper predication to get toll records, or in the old days, a pen register on a investigative target's phone, and then necessarily everyone the target called comes into the toll record, comes into the pen register. That's just how it works. That's what investigations are supposed to do. And if there's proper predication, you then go to the second step to see if there's a basis for investigation of the person at the other end of the call. So let's just understand that we shouldn't be drawing a lot of irate conclusions before we know what the facts are in the context of how such investigations actually work. Here's the second thing, and this goes back to the ranking member's comments about yesterday. To me, yesterday was an awful day in the history of this committee. It set new low after new low after new low. And I'm not going to talk about all of the new lows. I'm going to talk about one in particular. And that is whether anybody noticed the irony that the day before the United States Department of Justice arraigned a former FBI director for allegedly making untruthful statements to this committee, the Attorney General of the United States sat right there and made untruthful statements to this committee. And they weren't maybe untruthful statements. This wasn't a question of nuance. She made allegations about the ranking member and me having received political contributions from some, she said, Epstein close confidant. Well, guess what? That's actually checkable. There's a thing called the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission keeps a website that tracks all of our contributions. An intern at the Department of Justice could have checked to see that the allegation, I'll leave it to myself, that I had received campaign contributions from this individual, that was false. And it's not a maybe answer, it's a yes or no. Did I or didn't I? And there's an unimpeachable record that shows that what she said sitting right there was not true. If we are going to care about untruthful statements made by the Department of Justice and the FBI in this committee, let's not have this be yet another area where there are different rules for one party than for the other party. And just by the way, on that very subject, the other thing that the Attorney General did sitting right there was to strip all cover away from the untruthful statements that had been made to this committee by the current FBI director. You all heard him here. He said that he couldn't tell us about his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case, where he first pled the Fifth, then.
But nobody expected Whitehouse to walk in with receipts that would leave the FBI director exposed, the DOJ cornered, and the committee suddenly unsure of what was true anymore. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He didn't swing wildly. Instead, he dismantled the story piece by piece, calmly, methodically, like someone who has been waiting years to say the quiet part out loud. And by the time he finished, even people who walked into that room believing everything was fine had to admit something was very wrong. Because this wasn't just about one disagreement or one misstatement. This was about an entire system showing cracks in real time. And those cracks were beginning to widen. What he exposed next wasn't gossip, wasn't rumor, wasn't partisan noise. It was a showdown between truth and power, wrapped inside a single hearing that the public almost overlooked. But once you hear the details, you'll understand why this moment hit harder than anything that came before. Whitehouse began by revisiting what many tried to dismiss, the investigation nicknamed Arctic Frost. Critics said it was politically weaponized, a witch hunt, a targeted strike. But he flipped that narrative instantly. He reminded everyone that after the Capitol was breached, people weren't arguing politics, they were hiding. Senators, staff, police officers, all fearing what might happen next. Everyone in the building knew crimes had been committed that day. Everyone knew they had to be investigated. And everyone knew that refusing to investigate would have been the real scandal. He wasn't asking for applause. He wasn't even defending the FBI. He was pointing out basic reality. When something that serious happens, an investigation isn't optional. It's mandatory. But here's where things get interesting, because he wasn't defending institutions blindly. He was setting the stage. He was cleaning the noise out of the air so that when he delivered the next part, nobody could pretend they misunderstood. The controversy over senators' numbers appearing in investigative lists had exploded into panic. Headlines screamed about FBI spying, targeting officials, weaponizing tools, and more. But Whitehouse cut through that frenzy with one of the simplest explanations possible. He said, "Calm down. Understand how investigations actually work. Toll records, the modern version of old-school pen registers, don't record conversations. They simply show who called who. That's it. If you investigate a criminal target and that target calls a senator, the senator's number will appear automatically. That doesn't make the senator a target. It makes them a phone number connected to someone under investigation." That he's right, and anyone with prosecutorial experience knows it. He even compared it to wiretaps, not to confuse the two, but to highlight the difference. A pen register is not a wiretap. The committee should be smart enough not to confuse them. And yet, some members did confuse them. Some pushed the idea that the FBI was hunting senators. Whitehouse made it clear, without predication, these tools can't be used. With predication, they must be used. That's how investigations prevent chaos. That's how evidence is gathered. That's how justice works. But this whole clarification wasn't the main event. It was the lead-in, because after clearing the fog around the toll records, he pivoted. And what he said next flipped the entire tone of the hearing. He said, "Yesterday was an awful day in the history of this committee." You could feel the weight drop. He wasn't being dramatic. He wasn't exaggerating. He was calling out something he believed crossed a line no official should ever cross. And then he named it clearly: false statements. Not alleged, not accidental, not ambiguous, directly false. The day before, the Attorney General sat in the same chair and claimed that certain senators, including Whitehouse himself, had received money from someone she described as a close confidant of Epstein. Whitehouse didn't respond emotionally. He didn't accuse her of malice. He did something more devastating. He walked through basic verification. There's a thing called the Federal Election Commission. Every donation, every contributor, every dollar, all of it publicly searchable. An intern could have checked it. Anyone could have checked it. And the record showed that the AG's claim wasn't true. Maybe not true. Not possibly confused. Straight up false. And this is where the hearing shifted from disagreements to something more alarming. Because when the Attorney General of the United States makes a claim on live record that can be disproven by publicly available documents, it raises a question far bigger than any single hearing. How did that statement get made? Was it rushed? Was it misinformed? Was it never vetted? Or, this is where the speculation begins, and must be framed carefully. Did someone inside the DOJ pass along bad information without checking it? Some commentators have suggested the possibility that internal communication may have broken down, or that someone jumped to conclusions before verifying the data. Reports claim staffers were stunned to see such an easily debunked claim presented so confidently. Whether those reports reflect what actually happened is unclear. But the fact remains, the claim was false, and Whitehouse wasn't done, because what came next wasn't about him. It was about the FBI director. You could feel the mood change again as he started laying out a sequence of statements the FBI director had made previously, statements about his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case. The director insisted he couldn't talk about it because the DOJ had sealed it. He said there was a court order preventing disclosure. He even named the judge he claimed issued that order. But then the chief judge himself contradicted those claims publicly. The judge said nothing prevented the director from discussing his testimony. No such order existed. That meant the director's statements to the committee, statements claimed to be under court order, were not accurate. Whitehouse offered the Attorney General a moment of rescue. A chance to say, yes, the DOJ sealed the testimony. But she didn't. She didn't clarify. She didn't correct. She didn't support the director's claims. She simply left them unprotected, layer upon layer, contradiction after contradiction. And in government, contradictions rarely happen by accident. They happen because something behind the scenes isn't aligned. Communication, legal interpretation, internal decisions, or administrative clarity. Some observers online have suggested there may be internal disagreements or miscoordination inside the DOJ about how much transparency to offer in cases like this. Others believe different divisions may not be sharing the same understanding of what is sealed and what is not. None of these theories are confirmed, but the confusion they're trying to explain is real. Then comes the final twist. When asked about the transcript of his testimony, the director claimed he worked with the DOJ to have it publicly released. Whitehouse asked the simplest question possible. Has it been publicly released? Yes or no? Everyone knew the answer. It hasn't. There is no public transcript. There is no release. The statement didn't match reality. Whitehouse pulled all these threads together, not to embarrass anyone, not to create chaos, but to make one point that should worry anyone who cares about accountability. You cannot have different rules for different people. If false statements matter when one official makes them, they matter when another official makes them too. Truth isn't a partisan privilege. It isn't a weapon. It isn't a shield. It's the one thing that holds the entire justice system together. And if that one thing begins to fade, the consequences reach far beyond one hearing. Whitehouse's closing wasn't loud. It was cold, direct, controlled. The kind of closing that hits harder because he didn't need volume. He only needed facts. The irony he exposed, the Department of Justice arraigning someone for false statements one day, while being accused of making false statements itself the day before, landed like a hammer. It wasn't meant to shock for entertainment. It was meant to warn, because institutions don't collapse in a single moment. They collapse in layers. And hearings like this show the layers. When grand jury testimony is misrepresented, when public records contradict official claims, when explanations shift, when corrections don't come, when the truth falls out of alignment with the narrative, it doesn't take long before people stop trusting anything at all. And that's why this hearing was different. Because one senator stood up and said the part nobody else wanted to say. That accountability has to be consistent, or it isn't accountability at all. That if you found this breakdown eye-opening and want more deep dive explainers into moments Congress hopes you forget, make sure you subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. More real stories are coming. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's next.